Ron Hughley for World Speed Museum in Wilsonville. I'm standing next to this beautiful 1959 Testarossa, body by Fantuzzi. I want to talk to you a little bit about this car, but before we talk about the car, let me tell you about the man himself, Enzo Ferrari. Enzo started racing in the 20s for Alfa Romeo, forming the Scuderia Ferrari team with such notables as Novellari and Ascari as his drivers. They drove up until the beginning of World War II. When World War II started, he had to go into the manufacturing business. After the war, Ferrari wanted to get back into racing. To get back into racing, he needed a way to fund that. And the only way that he could fund these beautiful race cars like this was through the streetcar program. So we all know of the Ferrari streetcar, but let's talk a little bit about where Enzo's heart was, and that was with race cars, especially the endurance type cars. The Testarossa started its life in 1956. 34 of these beautiful Testarossas were made. Of the 34, 5 were made for this model of 1959. Originally designed and built by Scaglietti, they went on in 1959-60 to be built by Fantuzzi, and this is a Fantuzzi-bodied car. The factory team entered in 20 races, and of the 20 races, 10 of them they finished first overall. The cars won Le Mans 3 times, it won Sebring 4 times, and it won Argentina twice. These cars would then go on to incredibly successful careers at the hands of privateers, and that's where this car really comes into play with us when it was sold for Johnny von Neumann to drive and Phil Hill to drive as privateers. They went and they took the car to the LA Times Grand Prix, which was at Riverside, California. Phil Hill drove this car to a first overall, lapping the entire field. It was an amazing success story for this car that really set its name within the record books. Jack Deathercut saw the success of this car and had to have it. So he bought it from Johnny von Neumann, as well as 5 other Testarossas, so he could get this particular car. With Pete Lovely driving at Sebring, the two of them really put on quite a show, with Pete Lovely doing a lion's share of the driving. They then took the car back west, where it raced up and down the west coast and had numerous wins, with the last win coming with Pete Lovely driving this car at the Westwood 3-hour endurance race. Pete raced the entire race and lapped the entire field for a great overall 1 finish. That finish alone inspired another privateer, a Yakima car dealer by the name of Dick Hahn, to purchase this car from Jack Deathercut. Dick had purchased a previous car from Deathercut and had won with it, but he wanted this car, so he purchased this car for his driver Jerry Grant to drive. The car went on to numerous wins, most notably winning the 1962 Portland Rose Cup. The car then was sold to Bob Lapman. He was known to drive this car around on the streets of Seattle, and Pete Lovely lived in Seattle, and he would hear this car racing around and going over the floating bridge of Washington, and he remembered how enjoyable it was to drive. He determined that he would get that car somehow if it was ever available. And that day came in 1968 when a friend said, "Pete, I know where the car's at, and the guy needs some money. We need to go see about buying it." So Pete raised the $2,000 to go purchase the car in 1968. The car was in a pretty rough set of conditions. The engine wasn't there, it was missing the exhaust, it was missing the radiator. But the gentleman that he bought the car from says, "Well, my friend has the engine, and for $200 you can go get the engine." So for $2,200, Pete had acquired the engine and the car, and all that was missing was the radiator and the exhaust. And after a year, he was able to locate those. So he now had all the parts and pieces to put the car back together. The only thing that he lacked was the funding to do it. So the car sat at the basement of the Alfa Romeo dealership until 1990, when Pete had finally gathered up enough money to restore the car to the beautiful glory that you see it here. This car would go on with Pete Lovely driving to race at Monterey 11 times and win many historic races. It raced up and down the West Coast again in the Vintage Historic Racing League. What's not to like about the beautiful styling, the red paint, the gorgeous sound that these V12s make? You have to just really enjoy these cars. And the fact that there was only 5 of these cars built in 1959 make them incredibly valuable. How do you put a price on something like this? Do you look at the provenance? Do you look at the fact that it was driven by Grand Prix champion, world champion Phil Hill? Or the fact that Pete Lovely ran this car and won with it on numerous occasions, both frontline and then restoring it to race in the historics? Or do you just put a value on it, the fact that it's one of a kind?